Welcome. The latter half of the 20th century was dominated by the Cold War. If you want to understand why, there was nearly 50 years of hostility between the United States, the Soviet Union, and their respective allies. You only need to look at this one picture. It's the mushroom cloud that appeared over Nagasaki due to the detonation of the atomic bomb there on August 9th, 1945. 3 days earlier, on August 6th, a similar cloud had appeared over Hiroshima with the detonation of an atomic bomb there. Simply stated, each side in the Cold War was terrified that the other side would do this to them. Before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no one had ever before seen such destructive power. Today, we'll take a look at the Cold War and at atomic weapons and the world that their use threatened to completely unmake. The term Cold War was in use by late 1945. It probably comes from the British author George Orwell, who is perhaps best known for such dystopian works as Animal Farm in 1984. Orwell feared that nations that possessed atomic weapons would be, in his words, unable to conquer one another. They are likely to continue ruling the world between them. And it is difficult to see how the balance can be upset except by slow and unpredictable demographic changes. Consequently, everyone's freedom would be undermined because the citizens of every nation, of whatever political stripe, would be paralyzed by the fear of nuclear war. At the end of his article, he introduced the term Cold War. The atomic age, with its threat to freedom, would produce political stasis. Each nation would foster, in his words, the kind of worldview, the kind of beliefs, and the social structure that would probably prevail in a state which was at once unconquerable and in a permanent state of Cold War with its neighbors. Perhaps ironically, a Cold War is a war fought without weapons, and yet the Cold War of the later 20th century was only made possible by the presence of a new kind of weapon, atomic weapons. Because the United States developed atomic weapons first, an arms race developed with the Soviet Union. On the one hand, the drive for global dominance resulted in a tragic irony. Because of the Cold War, hot wars, that is, wars with weapons, were also fought. Both the Korean War and the Vietnam War were hot wars. But, more broadly, as the 1940s gave way to the 1950s, and as later decades followed, there was a growing fear that the arms race could end with the most horrific of outcomes. And this is called MAD, M-A-D. The acronym means Mutually Assured Destruction. That is, if one country pressed the proverbial big red button, and if the other country did the same, the end result would be the total annihilation of everyone. Ironically, it was this fear of mutually assured destruction that prevented the use of nuclear weapons in war, even as the arms race progressed with nuclear weapons tested all across the globe. And the word MAD is really the perfect word for this paradox. But fear wasn't just due to possible scenarios. Between the late 1940s and the early 1960s, the major atomic powers of the world, that is, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, collectively conducted 353 nuclear tests across the world. And you run a nuclear test by exploding a nuclear bomb. And in the early 1950s, with the development of the hydrogen bomb, atomic weaponry became even more powerful. In fact, the hydrogen bomb was 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. In 1954, the United States conducted Operation Castle at Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. The new hydrogen bomb was named Castle Bravo, and it produced something new and tragic. As a result of Operation Castle, a Japanese fishing boat named Lucky Dragon No. 5 was unexpectedly covered in radioactive ash. And yet, the fishing boat was 100 miles away from the test site. All crew members became sick and were hospitalized with acute radiation syndrome. And after more than 6 agonizing months, one crew member died. This became the third nuclear tragedy in Japanese history. But, unlike Hiroshima and Nagasaki, this tragedy occurred in peacetime. News of the tragedy spread across the world, and a new word just as rapidly entered the common lexicon: fallout. The blast had been so powerful that radioactive debris was sent into the stratosphere. While there, it circulated, falling out over time in various locales. And then things went from bad to worse. Let's bring all of this home for a moment. Would you purchase a pre-packaged food product if you knew that there was even a small chance that the contents might be radioactive? I'm not kidding. Because within days of the Lucky Dragon No. 5 entering port, the Japanese government seized all of the tuna that the fishermen had caught. The reason was simple. The tuna was radioactive. And this affected more than just the Japanese. Much of the United States tuna supply was imported from Japan, and this meant that radioactive fallout was not, and would never be, a purely local matter. Nuclear contamination was environmental contamination on a potentially global scale. And as the 1950s progressed, radioactivity sharply increased in a variety of foodstuffs across the world. Here are a few examples. Japan experienced radioactive rain later in 1954, and in 1957 found that its brown rice was also contaminated. In 1956, in Britain, specifically in Wales, sheep bones were found contaminated with radioactive isotopes. In both Britain and in the United States, radioactive rain fell on pasture land, where cows consumed it, which resulted in their producing radioactive milk. And in the United States in 1958, 9 different states found that their wheat harvests were also radioactive. Nuclear tests had created international public health scares, and part of what made it so disconcerting was the seeming randomness of it all. As the late 1950s became the early 1960s, the threat of nuclear poisoning became part of everyday life. Radioactivity became a subject for popular literature and film, just as it was a subject for both political debate and popular protest. Just think of comic books. Whether we realize it or not, for many of us, comic books are the most immediately tangible connection that we have still today to the nuclear culture that pervaded the world more than a half-century ago. For example, the mythology of the Marvel Comics universe is heavily shaped by the Cold War. Consider the Hulk, who first appeared in May 1962, fusing the mythology of Frankenstein with the very real fears of the atomic age. The Hulk was created through exposure to the gamma rays emitted during a nuclear bomb test. Spider-Man is another example. His powers come from being bitten by a radioactive spider, and he debuted just a few months later in August 1962. For additional context, the Cuban Missile Crisis then took place just a few weeks later. We might think of comic books as escapist, and they no doubt are. But the context discussed here makes the superheroes of the very early 1960s a bit unsettling, too. The arms race of the Cold War defined the world between the late 1940s and the early 1960s. But within that context, we find a remarkable amount of protest, too. Some of this is now largely forgotten. Fears about the possibility of radioactive milk mobilized housewives to demand restrictions on nuclear testing. But some of this protest remains well known, such as Martin Luther King Jr.'s opposition to nuclear proliferation. And there were larger international protests too, such as those by the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Calls for peace and disarmament became a feature of many religious groups as well. So too, some of the scientists involved in making the first atomic weapons strongly opposed creating the hydrogen bomb. Of a special note here is the book and film One World or None, a collection of essays by leading scientists. It entered the New York Times bestseller list in 1946. But the simple phrase, one world, also bequeathed to many people a sense of global urgency, and this even before the first instances of nuclear fallout. The nuclear scares of the 1950s only vindicated the sense that humanity now faced a shared global future, either for better or for worse. It was the inescapable reality of mutually assured destruction that led, in 1963, to the signing of the Partial Test Ban Treaty. The push for a moratorium was especially popular in nations without nuclear weapons, notably Japan, but also Canada, Mexico, and a number of European countries. As evidence continued to mount of radioactive food and the possibility of still more fallout, it ultimately fell to Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union to pull back from the brink. But they only negotiated after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which was the closest that the world had come to renewed nuclear war. The resulting ban prohibited nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in the ocean, and on land. It did not prohibit nuclear tests underground, which is where they occur today. But in the decades that followed, almost every country on the planet signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty. In the American context, however, there is a notable development surrounding all of this. When President John F. Kennedy sought ratification of the treaty, he not only emphasized the horrors of mutually assured destruction, but also the environmental hazards of nuclear fallout. In his words, "These tests befoul the air of all men and all nations, the committed and uncommitted alike, without their knowledge and without their consent. We can hope that its prevention will enable those countries to see the world more clearly, while enabling all the world to breathe more easily." It was powerful rhetoric and effective political maneuvering, and it was successful too. The United States Senate ratified the Partial Test Ban Treaty on September 24, 1963. Yes, this was a victory, but a partial one. The nations of the world haven't disarmed, and although fallout has greatly decreased throughout the world, as the Cold War continued, the arms race did too. Consequently, still today, we live in the atomic age. So what? Because we live in a world where atomic weapons are a fact of existence, the shock and horror of their introduction to history is something that we probably don't even think about. But this is worth unpacking. Nuclear fear has become literal fodder for pop culture, and not just in comic books, but in other venues too, such as fiction and music. References to atomic warfare can be found in film too. Among the most well-known was Stanley Kubrick's utterly macabre film, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. It appeared in theaters in 1964, the year after the Partial Test Ban Treaty. Inspired by the 1958 novel Red Alert, the film ends with a montage of nuclear explosions. Dr. Strangelove perfectly exemplifies the fact that there is only the finest of lines between satire and cynicism. But this was no fictional dystopia. It was a real possibility. Leaping 2 decades into the future, nuclear realities also shaped the music industry. Consider the thrash metal band Megadeth. You'll note that in their name, death is spelled without the letter A. The band's name is a spelling variant of the technical term Megadeth, which was coined during the Cold War. It denotes death by the million. So, 10 Megadeaths meant 10 million deaths. And their albums often featured images of destruction, such as that which might come from a nuclear holocaust. Other examples drawn from pop culture could easily be multiplied. But there is a risk here. What is now a subject for entertainment was once a very real fear that defined people's lives. To be philosophical for a moment, perhaps cultures are like individuals, and that both are the product of habit, and a habit often remains long after its point of origin has been forgotten. The Cold War might be over, but the culture that it inspired remains fully present. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First, for a broad overview of the Cold War, read The Cold War, A New History by John Gaddis. It's easily approachable and a solid introduction to the topic. Second, and focusing on the environmental history of the same period, read Arming Mother Nature, The Birth of Catastrophic Environmentalism. Its author is Jacob Darwin Hamble. It is, in many ways, a work as engrossing as it is disconcerting. And finally, no less gripping, is Toshihiro Higuchi's award-winning book, Political Fallout: Nuclear Weapons Testing and the Making of a Global Environmental Crisis. It discusses in detail how knowledge of nuclear fallout developed in the decade leading up to the Partial Test Ban Treaty. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.